Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to AOGS-RAC Coastal Zone Risk Mitigation and Management Working Group Online Seminar Series, number 3. I'm the moderator today. My name is Qinglan Li from Shenzhen Institute of Advanced Technology, Chinese Academy of Sciences. Let me introduce the speaker today, Dr. Constance Chua. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Nanyang Technological University. Constance obtained her bachelor degree at University of Canterbury, New Zealand, and her PhD degree in Earth Sciences at Nanyang Technological University. Her research interests lie in disaster risk management, and she specializes in coastal hazards. The central theme of her research is to examine the vulnerability of infrastructure such as seaports to coastal hazards such as tsunami and storm surges. The area of focus is on the Asia-Pacific region, where disaster risk is to extreme sea level events remain poorly constrained. Her research seeks to quantify the impacts of coastal hazards on infrastructure through numerical simulations, statistical analysis, field surveys, and spatial assessment of digital archives. She hopes that what we do as academics can be translated into policies and practical measures that reduce our risk to natural hazards. Aside from her core research, Constance has also been an active participant of AOGS since 2017 and was a session convener in 2021. In 2020, Constance was involved in the drafting of a United Nations report on tsunami evacuation for schools during the COVID-19 pandemic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Constance Chua to share with us her research with the title of Understanding the Response of Coastal Infrastructure to Tsunami Impacts. Dr. Constance, please.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for the introduction. So, good afternoon, I'm Constance. Thank you for the introduction. And today I'll be discussing some of the work that I've done for my PhD and now as a research fellow. So my interest in the research is on how we can quantify tsunami impacts on critical infrastructure such as ports, and also to quantify the indirect impacts such as the impact of tsunami on global port network. So I'm not sure how many people in the audience know what tsunamis are. I just give you a brief idea of how they are being generated. So a tsunami can be generated by a few mechanisms, but most importantly is due to a sudden displacement of a water body, such as seas or lakes. Most commonly, we would see that a tsunami is being generated by earthquakes, where there is a sudden displacement of the seafloor, leading to the spread of the sea surface. And traveling waves to the wherever there's land. And there is also terrestrial or submarine landslides, volcanic eruption, as well as meteorite impacts. Of course, meteorite impacts is one of the least of our concerns right now. And the thing about tsunami is that it can travel to shore within minutes or within hours, depending on where it comes from. So in terms of disaster management, this is a bit more critical because it gives us either too short a time to prepare or just enough time to prepare. So I'm not sure how many of you know about what risk is. So in hazard risk, we're talking about the three components. One is hazards, one is the exposure, and the last thing is the vulnerability. So vulnerability talks about what is the potential for casualties to occur or for damage to arise or loss and disruption to occur. And when we look at it from a hazard perspective, we try to quantify vulnerability by looking at the relationship between the intensity of the hazard as well as the damage that is likely to occur. So tsunami vulnerability studies is a pretty recent field, and we can generally categorize them into three main topics. So the first being injuries and casualties. What is the potential for injuries and casualties to arise as a result of a tsunami? And the next is structural damage and its subsequent economic impacts. So like how likely is a building going to be damaged in a tsunami? And the last thing, which is even more recent a few, is social economic vulnerability. So it looks at the resilience or the coping capacities of a population in the times of tsunami. So these are the three broad categories within tsunami vulnerability study so far. And this field is pretty recent, with the coping capacities being something more recent. And for my research, I tend to look more at the structural damage and the consequent economic impacts that a tsunami can cause due to the structural damage. So one of the biggest research gap in this study, I have to mention first that the study of structural damage by tsunami is quite a recent thing. So after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, there is some interest in structural damage, but the research only started to gain momentum more after the 2011 Tohoku tsunami. But most of these studies since the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami most focuses on residential and commercial buildings. So very few studies actually consider how tsunami can impact on critical infrastructure such as highways, roads, bridges, and ports. And even where there have been studies on this critical infrastructure, they are mostly descriptive. So they describe the kind of damage that was observed, but they don't really quantify the vulnerability. So a proper risk assessment is needed for planning and mitigation strategies of this critical infrastructure. So my study mostly focuses on ports rather than the other critical infrastructure. So this is still a major research gap. And any disruption to port functions can have cascading impacts to local economy, global transportation systems, and the global supply chain. One thing to note is that shipping accounts for 80% of world trade. So any disruption can be quite critical for the entire supply chain. And one tsunami event could also cause widespread damage because it does not affect only one port. It could affect several ports at one time. Take, for example, in the 2011 Tohoku tsunami. So here we have the shipping routes from the in Japan, from the container vessels prior to the tsunami. But after the 2011 event, in the months following after tsunami, we see that about 14 ports were affected, and this resulted in the container ships to reroute to other places to dock their services. So in the months following after the tsunami, export and import trade contracted by about 58% and 62% respectively. This resulted in losses of up to 12 billion USD. And this is only just losses from trade, not losses from structural damage included. So my research objective was to develop various approaches that we can quantify the vulnerability of ports to tsunami impacts. And tsunami impacts have two different types, direct and indirect impacts. So when I look at direct impacts, I'm talking about structural damage to the port industry. So I was trying to quantify the vulnerability or what we call fragility of these port industries. And when I look at the indirect impacts, I want to see how the damage from these structural impacts can affect the rest of the system. So I aim to quantify the impacts of tsunami on the global port network. So first, let me talk about my work with the direct impacts, which is to try to quantify or characterize the structural fragility of port industries. So when I talk about structural fragility, I'm looking at what's the probability that a structure or a building and its components would sustain damage beyond a predefined threshold when it is subjected to hazard impacts. But when we talk about tsunami structural fragility, we are looking at the probability of structural damage and the tsunami flow characteristics. Common tsunami flow characteristics include inundation depth velocity and hydrodynamic forces. So a way of presenting structural fragility, not only for tsunamis as well, it's also the same for other hazards such as earthquakes and volcanoes, is to use fragility curves. To build a fragility curve, we need firstly the damage data. Next, we need the tsunami intensity measure, which I have mentioned is something like the inundation depth velocity or the hydrodynamic forces. It depends on what the person chooses to use as a measure of the damage. And then we needed a statistical model that can link both the damage and the intensity measure together to build our fragility curves. So in my study, I used the 2011 Tohoku tsunami as a case study. The tsunami was caused by a magnitude 9.0 megatrust earthquake off the Pacific coast of the Tohoku region. So it's like on the east side. And tsunami waves were up to 40 meters in inundation heights. So why I chose the 2011 Tohoku tsunami is that it was extremely well documented. As you might know, tsunami events are quite infrequent, so that leaves us with very few data to work with. But the 2011 Tohoku tsunami was well recorded. They had high spatial resolution of satellite images that we can observe the damage from. There was also densely recorded inundation depths along the coast of the Honshu region of Japan. So it gives us a lot of data to work on. And I looked at 6 different ports across the Tohoku region, starting with Hachinohe in the north and Onahama in the south. So first, I need to collect my damage data because previously, most of the damage data that was collected was only for commercial and residential buildings. There was none for port structures. So one thing we needed was the tsunami flow characteristics. So what I did was to collect inundation depth values based on field surveys from the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transportation Authority, and then I need to create an inventory of the port structures. And then I also needed pre and post tsunami images to see the type of damage that was sustained by each of this structure. And unique to this study is that I classified the structures according to the industries. Because previously, when people study residential and commercial buildings, they tend to look at the construction material of the buildings, such as reinforced concrete, masonry, and wood. But I thought the industries, the different type of industries would consist of different typical infrastructure that you will observe. So I classified them according to their industries. So in the Tohoku region, I have identified 8 different port industries, such as the cargo handling facilities, warehouse and distribution, as well as petrochemical industry. So these are just the 8 that I managed to identify from my observation. And then I need to propose a damage scale for port structures. So previously when they studied buildings, there was only a damage scale for buildings, but I thought that, okay, we also need a damage scale for infrastructure, since port structures are not only limited to buildings, but also to things like cranes, silos or tanks. So here's my proposed damage scale. DS0 is where there is no damage, and DS4 is where there's highest level of damage. So for example, DS1 is where there is water penetration into the building, and what you need is just to clean up. There is no very visible damage. But DS4 is where the building is has totally failed, either overturned or slide from its original position. So you can no longer use the building or the infrastructure. So to assess the damage for the pod structures, I use a myriad of resources. So the first thing I did was to use Google Earth to look at the buildings pre-tsunami and post-tsunami. So over here we have the example of a building, of a facility prior to the tsunami in Ishinomaki Port, and then after the tsunami in 2011 at the same place. And at the same place, we also have the oblique and street view images to complement my damage observation. So I managed to catalog about 5,000 port structures for their damage, and also include their inundation depth values. And this catalog of the damage data is now available online for use. So using the information from the inundation depth values as well as the damage sustained by each of these port structures, I use it to build my fragility functions. So this is an example of how a fragility function would look like for any one of the port industry. I would just slowly go through with you on how we can interpret a fragility function. So here you can see at the bottom there's purple, blue, yellow, and red. So this represents the different damage levels. So DS1, as I mentioned, is where there is the minimal damage, and DS4 is the highest level of damage, where the building can no longer be in use. So how we will read this is, okay, on the x-axis, we have the observed inundation depth. And on the y-axis, we have the probability of exceeding the damage level. So we can say that at 2.5 meters, the probability of exceeding damage level 2, DS2, is about 0.6. So this is how we interpret the fragility functions. So for this work, I managed to develop the fragility functions for 8 different port industries. For example, here we have manufacturing and petrochemical industries. So for that work, that is the structural damage. The next thing I did was to look at the indirect impacts, which is to quantify the impact of tsunami on the global shipping network. So specifically, the questions that I posed was how many ports will be impacted by a tsunami event, and how are the rest of the global port network indirectly impacted by this event, and how long does it take for the damaged port to recover its functions. So I use network centrality as a way to observe the changes in the port network after a tsunami event. So network centrality is a concept that arises from social sciences in the 1950s. It measures the influence and significance of a node within an overall network. So a node is like a hub within a network. For example, nodes can be represented by the train stations or can be represented by the airports. So in the overall network of the airports, how important is one particular airport as compared to the rest? So network centrality in transport geography has been mostly used to study what is the relationship between two nodes. For example, two airports. What's the relationship between Hong Kong Airport and Shanghai Airport? Or to determine in the overall network how important is this particular airport. But taking this theory, I decided to use it to quantify the severity of tsunami impacts on the global shipping network, as well as to measure the changes within the global port network. So I just want to introduce some basic theories within network centrality. So we represent seaports as nodes, and the shipping routes between any two ports are represented by ages. So between Sydney and Perth, you can see the shipping route between these two is called an age, and then each of this port is called a node. But bear in mind, between any two ports, there can be more than one age. So for example, company A travels between Perth and Sydney, that's also one age. And then company B might also have a same shipping route between the two ports, and that would be another age. So between two ports, it can have more than one age. So one of the most common measure of network centrality is degree centrality. This measures the number of edges that are connected to the node. Take for example, here we have a few ports that are connected to each other. We can say that Hong Kong has a high degree centrality because Hong Kong is connecting between, let's just say, to get from Busan to Perth, we still have to go through Hong Kong. To get from Busan to Tokyo, you still have to go through Hong Kong. Whereas to go from Tokyo to Busan, you also have to go from Hong Kong. So we can say that a lot of traveling routes have to travel between Hong Kong on the way. So this measures how popular this node is. So we say that, okay, how well connected or how popular this node is in the whole network. And the next thing is there is another measure called the betweenness centrality. This measures the number of shortest paths that are connected to the node. How do we interpret this? So from Busan to get to Perth, you have to pass through Hong Kong and Sydney. So we can say Hong Kong and Sydney lies in the shortest path between Busan and Perth. And similarly, from Tokyo to Perth, you have to go through Hong Kong and Sydney. So we can say that the Hong Kong and Sydney also lies within the shortest path. Whereas to get from Busan to Shanghai, there's no need to pass through any place. So there is no node lies between the shortest path of Busan and Shanghai. So what betweenness centrality does is to measure that measure how many shortest routes are connected to this particular node. So we are talking about how important this node is in the information flow. And I used the data that was collected by Shi and authors in 2020. So they have collected information from the top 100 liner companies in terms of the service lines that they have. And what we see is that in their data, we have about 977 ports or nodes, and there are 16,679 edges or service routes between two ports. So this is the data that we have from 2015. This sort of data is quite expensive to obtain, so it's not easy to get the latest information as well. So we need to establish a criteria where we say, okay, this is the particular point where a port will lose its function in a tsunami. So as I mentioned before, the 2011 Tohoku tsunami provides a great resource for a lot of this information. So I took a look at how many ports, what was the wave height that resulted in the damage to the ports during the 2011 event. So we can see that at 3.3 meters, the ports were damaged and have lost their functions during the 2011 event. So we set 3.3 as the minimum criteria for the damage of ports and therefore the loss of port functions. So taking the 3.3 meters as the criteria, we can apply it to a case study. So I use a hypothetical scenario from Manila Trench rupture. Why I chose the Manila Trench is because tsunami threat within the South China Sea Basin is generally underestimated. The Manila Trench has not ruptured for a long time, so we don't know when was the last event, but we know that there is such a trench and it has the capability of generating basin-wide tsunami waves. So to model tsunami propagation, we use the fault parameters that was proposed by Chua and authors, and then we use Tsunami and to model the tsunami wave heights. So here I present the results from a hypothetical scenario from Chua and authors. So they use a combination of out-of-sequence thrust and a mega transfer of the northern Manila Trench, and it assumes a 1,000 year seismic return period. So this is the worst case scenario that was presented by Chua and authors. And using their fault parameters, what we found is that up to 6 ports could be damaged in this scenario, including major ports such as Kaohsiung and Hong Kong. And waves in the southeastern Chinese coast could go up to 7.2 meters. And the next thing is we use network centrality to determine. So, okay, for example, 3.3 was the limit, and then if we have 6 ports that were down, how many service routes will be disrupted? So we can see here on the left, we have the original number of edges, which is the service routes. That is 6,679. After a hypothetical worst scenario, Manila Trench tsunami, about 400 service routes will be disrupted. And this is way higher than previous tsunami events, such as the 2010 Chile and the 2011 Tohoku tsunami. But in all these events, about 5 to 6 ports were supposedly damaged, but yet the Manila Trench tend to lose more service routes as compared to past events. I'm not surprised because the South China Sea Basin is home to some of the world's most busiest ports. For example, I think about 10 of the ports within the South China Sea Basin is considered as the top 50 world's busiest ports. So definitely more service routes are expected to be damaged. I mean, to be disrupted from events such as the Manila Trench tsunami. And I also use bituminous centrality to see how ports are affected beyond those that are already structurally damaged. So ports that are not structurally damaged, how are they also affected? So we look at the rate of change in the bituminous centrality. If the rate of change is more than 1, it means that it's a positive thing, means that more ships will be calling at that port, means more service routes would use that port as an alternative port in the tsunami. But if the rate of change is less than 1, for example, in Tanjung Pelapas in Malaysia, in the 2018 crocodile tsunami, means that less ships are calling at a particular port. It receives less port calls. So, for example, if a ship was supposed to dock at Tanjung Pelapas, but because the tsunami happened, they chose to dock at another port. So this particular port has lost the services that it used to provide. So to make it a bit simpler to understand, we can use a hypothetical scenario to see what does it mean by changes in the bituminous centrality. So take, for example, this is a very simple network. It may not be true, but I'm just creating a scenario. So to get from Busan to Perth, the shortest route would, let's just say, be through Hong Kong and Sydney. But due to the tsunami, Hong Kong loses its port function, so it's no longer in operation. So instead of passing through Hong Kong and Sydney, the ship from Busan will have to go through Shanghai, Tokyo to Perth. And in this sense, the ship no longer docks at Sydney. So this means that their bituminous centrality has fallen below 1. And when it passes through Shanghai and Tokyo, it increases the number of ships that are calling at these 2 ports. It means that their bituminous centrality has increased to beyond 1. So that's just a simple way of understanding things. And we take we take a potential Manila Trench tsunami as the case study. We mentioned that the 6 ports will be affected. And if we look at Ningbo, Zhoushan, and Shenzhen ports, we can see that bituminous centrality in the tsunami would increase to beyond 1. So it means that it serves as an alternative port in the event of a Manila Trench tsunami. Whereas Hong Kong, the bituminous centrality drops from 1 to 0. This means that it no longer functions as a port in this event. And the next thing I did was to try to look at how long it takes for these ports to recover, because based on what we observed from the 2011 Tohoku tsunami, the recovery could take up to a year. So I collected information on port destruction from past tsunami events such as the 2010 Chile, 2015 Chile, and 2011 Tohoku and 2018 crocodile tsunamis. So I correlate the days of disruption with the height of the tsunami waves. So over here on this diagram, you can see in red we have shut down. This means that the port totally shut down and is no longer receiving any ship call. And partial recovery means that the port is open to receiving port calls, but it is not operating as it was prior to the tsunami. So it's operating partially. And the total affected days is a combination of the shutdown days and the partial recovery days. So recall that I mentioned in the southeastern Chinese coast, Manila Trench tsunami could go up to 7.2 meters. That means that the total number of affected days for port recovery could even go up to more than 200 days. So to conclude, a tsunami generated by a Manila Trench rupture could damage up to 6 ports within the South China Sea Basin. And as a result, more service routes would be disrupted as compared to past tsunami events. And when we look at a worst case scenario, the recovery of port functions could extend up to 200 days. So that's all from me for now. Yeah, thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
Okay, any questions from the audience?
Hi, Constance.
Hello.
Constance, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I have a question about the recovery time for the port that you have present. Is there any relationship between recovery time is there a relationship between the size of port and the magnitude of tsunami when you study the recovery time in your study?
Yeah. Okay, so when I was studying these, I did not look at the size of the pot. As you mentioned, that is a very important point because different pots can host different number of tonnage of boats. So I think it's a good point to point out because I also think in future we should look at the size of the pots to know that if it's just because the entire pot was damaged, or was it just because one pot can or is it just because one pot can host more ships than the other? That's why they are able to recover faster. Yeah, so I think that has to be taken into account. So far, this study is still in the initial stages. So I have been trying to get the data from the different ports in these areas. Like we are trying to purchase the data to know exactly how long they took to recover, and is it because the different tonnage that can be received by each port is different also.
Thanks, Constance.
No worries.
The chat box, there's a question from Jonathan Canberra.
Yeah, why you use unweighted graph in finding the shortest path rather than the weighted graph? All right. Thank you, Jonathan, for the question. It is not because I chose to use an unweighted graph, but at that point, because this research I have only just started sometime this year, so I have not looked into the distance between the distance of the edge to compute the shortest path. So far, I only managed to collect the data just purely from the connection between the different ports, just to plot the shortest path. But definitely, if I could get the information on the distance, the actual physical distance between the edges, that would be much better. I would like to use weighted graph in the future, but for now, I have only started off with trying to use an unweighted graph. Yeah. I would also want to consider, as I've mentioned before, the tonnage in each of these service routes. So, for example, if one ship travels from one port to another, what was the tonnage that is carrying, just so that I know, so that I can add extra weight to each of these ages. Yeah, if that makes sense. But thank you for the question. I hope it answers what you were asking. Are there any other questions from the audience?
I have a question from myself.
Okay.
Is there any tsunami that happens twice at the same or very close location in the world?
Oh, as in the South China Sea Basin?
No. I mean, is there any tsunami that happens several or a couple of times at the same location or very close on the location, adjacent location? The tsunami happens again. I mean, in the same location?
Oh, in the Manila Trench?
No, I just wonder.
In the same location if there has been previous tsunamis?
Yes.
Okay. The thing is, right now they are collecting information. Like there have been several papers that was trying to hypothesize when was the last time a Manila Trench occurred, because some use the sediment studies in the southeastern Chinese coast. So what they observed there were all very different from what the sediments that were collected in the, let's just say, Philippines and Taiwan. They look very different in terms of the interval of the tsunami. So they could not really identify when was the last time the tsunami happened, but they know that the trench exists. It's just that there was no recurrence interval that people could really peg down. Yeah. So for the Manila Trench, it's so understudied because nobody really knows when was the last occurrence and when will it rupture again. So we only know it will happen, but we just don't know when. Yeah. So I'm also not sure, like, okay, for example, in Japan, some of the fault lines have ruptured before and it was recorded. But for the Manila Trench, it was more poorly recorded. So there was not many evidence that point to when was the last tsunami. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions from the audience? Okay. Do you have anything to present us more? I mean, about how about your future study?
Hold on. There is one question from that.
Yeah, sorry, just very quick question. Constance, how about Singapore port? Is there any study about the tsunami damage to the coastal infrastructure in Singapore port?
Currently our group is looking at if we were to simulate the Manila Trench tsunami, and in the Manila Trench is very long, right? So the southern part of the Manila Trench, we are trying to see if it ruptures, whether the tsunami can reach Singapore. So we are still doing that, but based on what I observed, it will be quite, the inundation will be very little, but we don't know about the currents. So our group is still trying to model the currents into Singapore, because if the current's strong, it means that the boats have the potential to break away from the anchor.
Okay.
And then the boats, if it's able to break away from the anchor, it also can cause damage to the port itself. If it goes around in the current. Yeah. So this is what our group is now trying to look at, whether we know that the inundation might be too little, even in the worst case scenario, plus a sea level rise. But what's that called? But we are now trying to see if we have currents on top of high tide. Will it affect our ports and from just currents itself, not from inundation? Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your
no worries. So Professor Lee, as for my future work, I have been trying to think of like combining different people's fault parameters, just to compare if we have a best case scenario and a worst case scenario, how many pots will be affected just based on the height of the tsunami. And then we also trying to think if we can consider different sea level rise scenario. So right now there is they have been proposing like different sea level rise tools after the IPCC report came out. So we trying to see if we based on the IPCC projection tool, we can add different height to the tsunami that will come in and just see if the ports will be more affected or not. Because now my scenario is based on non-sea level rise future. Yeah. Yeah. Another thing, of course, we want to collect more port data in terms of how much tons each port receives in this area. And we also want to see if some ports actually are affected, but not as affected because it receives less port costs as compared to other ports. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any questions from the audience? Okay. If there's nothing else we need to discuss today, so let's wrap up the meeting and let's thanks for all the audience and thanks for Constance. See you next time.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor
Thank you
Lee.
very
See
much.
you all next time.
See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.